Okay, well it's just about 4 o'clock now, so I'll start. The short video I just showed you was a bike ride that Rob here, myself and 2 other vegan cyclists did this time last week. In fact, we were somewhere in the traffic in central London at 4 o'clock last Saturday afternoon. We cycled from the Vegan Society headquarters in Birmingham to Olympia, where the UK VegFest Vegan Festival was over the weekend. Then when we got there, we had a kind of question and answer session like this. We were doing it for a number of reasons. One of them was to promote Veganuary, and if you don't know about Veganuary, they're not actually here this weekend. I'll tell you a bit more about that at the end. So I'm Mick Walker. I am vegan. How many of you are actually vegan? So more of you are not. That's what I tend to find at these festivals. I speak at most of them. A lot of people who attend them, I think, are people who are possibly vegetarian and thinking of becoming vegan. They want a bit more information, they want a bit more guidance, and hopefully I can help to provide that. I've been vegan for a number of years, and I'm also a cyclist, as you can see, and I realised that actually, as I got older, my vegan diet was definitely helping me to maintain my health and fitness. So I decided that I really wanted more people to know about this. I wanted to publicise it, I wanted to educate more people. So I kind of set myself up as the vegan cyclist, which I suppose might have been a bit rash in a way, but I did. I discovered that vegancyclist.com was already taken in America as a website, but I was able to get vegancyclist.co.uk. There's quite a lot of information on my website, so I apologise if I go fairly quickly this afternoon, but I've got a card, I can access my website, and most of the stuff I'm talking about, there are links to it on my website. I live on what's called a whole food plant-based diet. Now the word vegan, I'm afraid, is slightly controversial. I hadn't realised it when I first set up my website. There's kind of a distinction between people who are vegan and people who are just plant-based. And veganism is definitely a whole lifestyle. I mean, I think it's absolutely abhorrent the way we treat other animals. I think animal agriculture is by far the greatest threat to the environment. I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a moment. And those 2 aspects are just as important as our own health. So there are people out there who actually probably eat quite an unhealthy vegan diet, and they're basically vegan for the animals, which is how they would probably call it. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but the word vegan was coined in 1944 by a guy called Donald Watson, and he set up the Vegan Society here in Birmingham, and this is supposedly the definition that he used initially. Basically says we should live a life where we do not exploit any other animals in any way whatsoever. So that's for food, for other products like leather and so on, and for entertainment. And he got the word vegan by taking the word vegetarian, using the first 3 letters, the last 2 letters, and got vegan. Most people often don't realise that, but that's necessarily the case. Interestingly, veganism does seem to be quite significantly on the rise. A couple of vegans in America called themselves a vegan couple, posted a questionnaire on the internet. This is about 12 months ago, and they got 6,000 responses. And of those 6,000, about 80% of them were women, and only about 20% of them were from men. And there is a general perception that it's more difficult to persuade men to become vegan than women. I don't really see why that should be, but that does seem to be the case. At the same time, they asked people why they became vegan, and this survey, 70% of them said it was for ethical reasons, which is often cited as the reason for becoming vegan. Only about 20% for health reasons, and about 7% for environmental reasons. And they asked them, do you think you'll always stay vegan? And 90% of them said yes. People are always posting stuff on the internet to say that, you know, most vegans, most vegetarians eventually go back to eating meat again. I don't think that's true. And I can't see, I mean, I'm sure some do, but once you become vegan, I can't see why you'd ever go back to eating meat again. I mean, even more interesting, you've probably seen this, earlier this year there was this survey done in the UK which suggested that 350% rise in vegans in the UK in the last 10 years. Now, it's still a relatively low number, it's 500,000 people, but another 500,000 who are vegetarian are considering becoming vegan. And interestingly, in this survey, most people said it was for health reasons. So I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, just to kind of make sure I'm clear about my vegan credentials, I mean, human beings absolutely dominate this planet. It's been posted this week and it's been on the news that we perhaps ought to have a name for our current geological period, and that is Anthropocene. Absolutely dominated by human beings. And there is no doubt whatsoever, we absolutely dominate this planet. We're destroying it. I know that sounds a bit negative, and I don't mean to be, but we are. I'll draw your attention to some authors and some books in a moment who talk about this. You know, we are just one species amongst millions, and we really ought to be striving to live in much greater harmony on this planet than we are at the moment. And more people are actually beginning to realise this. I mean, I've read an awful lot of books in the last few years. I've searched the internet for more and more information. So I just want to recommend one or two books for you if you haven't ever come across them. This is a guy called John Robbins. He's an awful lot of these books are written in America at the moment. I've got possibly plans to write one or two books, but an awful lot of the stuff that I've been reading, it's nearly all coming from America. Now he was Robbins, as in Baskin Robbins' ice cream empire. The Baskins of Baskin Robbins was his uncle. The Robbins obviously was his father. And he realised when he was a teenager that his uncle had died from a heart attack in the early 50s. His father wasn't in the best of health, and he himself wasn't actually in the best of health. He talked in his book about having so much ice cream available in his house. He could have it for breakfast, he could have it 3 times a day, he could eat it before he went to bed. And he started to sort of look into this a little bit, and he became absolutely convinced that the diet they were eating, which is often called the SAD diet, the Standard American Diet, was harming them and harming the whole of the American population. And he actually completely turned his back on his inheritance, which was presumably enormous. And he wrote a book called A Diet for a New America. That was in 1987. And he followed it up with this book more recently called The Food Revolution. And he is advocating here a whole food plant-based diet for health reasons, for reasons that we no longer need to exploit animals in the way that we do, and for environmental reasons. And I strongly recommend that book. Another book that is sold in huge numbers is this World Peace Diet by a guy called Dr. Will Tuttle. Now, again, he's an American. He has a Facebook page called the World Peace Diet. I'll give you 2 words that appear in his book. One of them is that we're on a course of suicide. We're killing ourselves, and we're on a course of geocide. We're destroying the planet. And it's a pretty hard-hitting book, this, but I'm convinced it's absolutely right. Another American lady is called Dr. Melanie Joy. Now, she is a psychologist, and she's written a very interesting book. It's only about 150 pages long. It doesn't take a lot of reading. And it's called Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs and Wear Cows. And she's coined the term carnism. And carnism really is a lifestyle where we exploit other animals. And she queries this in her book, and she questions, whether this really ought to be the way we're living, and whether it really is going to have to be got rid of if humans and the planet are going to survive. 2 things I found quite shocking about what she had to say. The first one was, when you query people about why they eat meat, why they use animal products, they'll just say, well, that's the way it is. They don't even think about it. They give it no thought whatsoever. Secondly, she says, actually, in the end, people think it's the 3 ends. It's normal, it's natural, and it's necessary. Well, I can assure you, I'm 100% convinced it's not normal, it's not natural, and it's not necessary. And I strongly recommend Melanie Joy's book to you as well. If you haven't seen Cowspiracy, this is a documentary that any would-be vegan ought to see. This is largely about the environmental impact of animal agriculture. I didn't think I was going to learn anything from it. I was horrified when I eventually saw it a year or 2 ago. I mean, it is horrendous. The environmental impacts of animal agriculture far outweigh any other human activity on this planet, by far. And the guy who made the film is a guy called Kip Anderson. He's just made another film, which is about to be released in America, called What the Health. And it's all about the pharmaceutical industry. And I've seen some snippets of it on the internet, and I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of that, because I can imagine that's going to be pretty hard hitting as well. His film has caused lots of very prominent people to choose to become vegan. James Cameron, the film director, basically said when he watched Cowspiracy, he became vegan overnight, and he's become a big campaigner, you know, in America. My background is actually in biology, so I entirely understand that it is not efficient to use a piece of land to raise animals. It's even less efficient to use a piece of land to grow plants to feed to animals, which is what we're doing. I mean, it makes no sense whichever way you look at it. And, you know, at the end of Cowspiracy, there's an awful lot of figures about how much a vegan saves in terms of water usage, in terms of reducing pollution, the amount of CO2, our carbon footprint, the amount of methane produced by animal agriculture is vast. You know, it's a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. I mean, there are figures mentioned in Cowspiracy that suggest that animal agriculture could be over 50% of our contribution to global warming in the greenhouse. Over 50%. All the transportation in the world is down at around 15%. So the difference is absolutely enormous. Right, so there's my sort of vegan rant for a moment. Now, what about the health aspects? Well, way back in the 19th century, Thomas Edison, who was an American businessman, said basically that in the future, if people get their diets right, we won't really need doctors. Now, I reckon he's pretty well, you know, we do get infectious diseases, we do break bones and things like that. But the scourge of humanity at the moment are chronic diseases. And I am convinced, from my own experience and what I've read, that they are 100% diet related. I mean, I'm not 100%. Now, one or two books again that I would strongly recommend. This was written by a guy called Garth Davis. He, as you can see, it's called Proteinaholic, and he actually busts the myth that we need a huge amount of protein. In fact, he provides the evidence here to a lot of other people now that large amounts of animal protein are positively harmful. And some of the chronic conditions that we thought were down to fat and sugars, they certainly play a part. Actually, a lot of them can be put down to animal protein as well. And the interesting thing about Garth Davis was he runs a weight reduction clinic in Houston in Texas. And he discovered at one point that he wasn't terribly well himself. I think he was having an eye test, and the optometrist said he could detect some cholesterol in the capillaries in his eye. So he kind of researched into this. You know, he was a bit worried. He thought he was keeping a pretty healthy lifestyle and realised he wasn't. And he came out with the conclusion, actually, the best way forward was on a whole food, plant-based diet. The other two things he said that were interesting in this book was that when he went to medical school, he was following in his father's footsteps, so it was kind of natural he would become a doctor. When he went to medical school, it was kind of just, you know, an accepted fact that humans get ill. You know, no one queried it. Everyone gets ill sometimes. So we need doctors, we need drugs and medication, and we need surgery. The other thing is, not for 1 minute in the whole of his course was diet considered. Not for 1 minute. And that's true still today of most medical courses. If you follow all this on the internet and so on, there are one or two medical schools now starting to introduce a bit about that, especially in America, and I'll talk a bit more about that perhaps in a moment. And he's basically saying, actually, doctors on the whole are misleading people. Doctors, the majority of them, none of you are doctors, I'm going to criticise you here, but you know, so many of them actually don't really understand the benefits of a whole food plant-based diet. They're beginning to in America, and I'm really keen to try and get it kind of catch on here a bit more. He's also got a great website, which is called Proteinaholic. There's all sorts of information on there if you're interested. Now this is a really interesting guy. He's called Dr. Michael Greger, and he wrote a book called How Not to Die. Now, actually, all of these books are kind of reviewed on my website, which I mentioned earlier, so you can go and have a look at them there if you like. Now obviously he doesn't mean how not to die at all, he means how to avoid dying prematurely. He has 15 chapters, and every chapter is devoted to a chronic condition which he provides evidence for the fact they are all avoidable and reversible on a whole food plant-based diet. Not just, you're not going to be a bit better, you're going to be... So that's well, number one killer in America from early death is coronary heart disease. Number two are cancers. Number three, believe it or not, are side effects of medication. And then you've got diabetes and high blood pressure and Alzheimer's and suicide and depression. These are all considered in the first half of his book. It's a really, it's a really interesting book. And in the second half of his book, he tries to provide some advice as to how people can live on a more healthy diet. And he categorises foods into what he calls his traffic light foods. Red light foods should be avoided. So those are basically animal products and processed plant foods. Now by processed plant foods, that means no added sugar, no added oil, no white flour, those sorts of things. If the plant foods are slightly processed, I mean, we're all going to eat some slightly processed plant foods at times. But what he's really recommending is the green light. That's a whole food plant-based diet. All you're eating are plants, and those plants are as close to their original form as possible. So, don't buy anything in packets, don't buy anything with ingredients, buy peppers and onions and kale and spinach, potatoes, rice, eat those, and whole grains. Forget about white processed flour. And to help people to do that, he's produced a thing which he calls his Daily Dozen. And he's actually produced an app, so you can put an app on your phone. If you really want to keep a check on it, you can tick off when you've eaten. So he's proposing here, we should be eating beans every day. Well, I certainly do pretty well. Lots of fruits and berries, and obviously other fruits as well. Cruciferous and green. He's big on kale, broccoli. He thinks broccoli is an absolutely superfood. Spinach, all the green vegetable foods. Colourful foods, red peppers, yellow peppers, all those sorts of things. They're full of antioxidants, they're full of phytonutrients and so on. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And he's also got the most wonderful website. It's called nutritionfacts.org. Now he puts little videos on here almost every few days. And if you sign up to it, you'll probably get an alert to say he's just posted another one. If there's anything that you're concerned about in terms of your health or your diet, I'll bet it'll be on here. I'd be very surprised if it's not. Everything is on here. And he goes around America talking all the time. He doesn't make any profit out of this website. He's a great chap. And he does live sessions as well on Facebook, where people can send him in questions and he'll answer them live. So, he's a great guy, Michael, great guy. I'm not sure whether he's vegan in the sense that he might well wear leather shoes, I don't know. That intrigues me a bit about some of these characters. They're proposing a whole food plant-based diet, but it wouldn't surprise me if they wore leather shoes and belts, which I think is a bit distinct. They don't all do, I know one or two who don't. Maybe a little bit more about that later. Now, Forks Over Nights is another documentary. If you haven't seen this, you ought to. It's Forks Over Nights. It's called this because the advice is that we should be maintaining our health through what we eat, through our forks, and avoid going under the surgeon's knife. And it was a documentary in America, probably about 3 years ago now, I suppose. It spurned a kind of whole industry, so they've got recipe books, they've got a website, lots of information on it as well. And there's some really interesting characters in this film. One of them is this guy, he's called Dr. Caldwell B. Esselstyn Jr. Now, this guy is well into his 80s. He's still working as a heart surgeon. He and his son, Rip Esselstyn, who has his own website called Engine to Diet, they advocate a whole food plant-based diet. And he actually says in the film, he says, coronary heart disease is a paper-toothed tiger. It need never exist, and it can be cured by changing diet. And you listen to this guy, he's right, he knows what he's talking about. And it's beyond me why more people aren't listening to these sort of guys. I mean, he's wonderful, Caldwell Esselstyn. And he has these big plant-based conferences in America every year where he gets all of these big guys to come and talk and so on. And there's always these sort of cartoons posted on Facebook and Twitter and so on. This is basically a guy talking to his doctor. He says we could do bypass surgery. We could take a vein out of your thigh, open up your chest, sew the vein into your coronary artery. It's going to cost about $100,000. It'd keep you living for 2 months. Or you could try a vegan diet. And he says vegan diet, and that's a bit extreme, isn't it? I mean, people think like that. I mean, people actually think like that. People think, actually, I'll have the surgery, I'll carry on eating my diet, and I'll take the medication. I mean, I just find it baffling. This guy, another interesting guy, I think he's stepped down now, but he was, it says that, president of the American College of Cardiology. And he said, not too long ago, we have two types of cardiologists in America, vegans and those who haven't read the data. You know? This is an interesting guy's way. Now, he is vegan. I've seen an interview with him when 30 or 40 years ago he talks about burying his leather shoes, burying his leather belts. He features in Cowspiracy. He's also got a fantastic website with lots of information there. In Cowspiracy, which is where this clip is taken from, he's kind of explaining why we shouldn't be consuming milk. Now, if you haven't seen this little snippet is actually on YouTube. You don't have to watch the whole thing, you can find it on YouTube. It's called Michael Clapper, K-L-A-P-E-R. And he absolutely nails it here. He says, milk, it's baby calf growth food. Now, I'd have to say, I've never liked milk. In fact, I discovered recently, I didn't know, when I first went to school as a 3 or 4 year old, my mother asked them not to give me milk because she was a bit concerned about the health aspects of milk, even then, all that long ago. But the idea that we, as a species of mammal, would remove the milk from another species of mammal and consume it as adults doesn't make any sense whichever way you look at it. You know, somebody came round before someone went down to somebody's house and they said, you'd like some coffee? Yes, please. You have milk? Yes, please. Actually, I've run out of milk, but the dogs just had coffee, so I'll use some of that. I said, okay. They look at you like you're a man. Well, what's the difference? There's no difference. I mean, it is bizarre. So, dairy products, an absolute no-no. And, the doctor told me I need cow's milk. I had to remind him that I was not a cow, I'm human. Unbelievable, I think. Now, some of these guys I've been talking about, he's the one I just mentioned, Cordell Esselstyn, he's Michael Greger, who I've also mentioned, that's Michael Clapper, I've also mentioned him. This is an interesting guy, he's called John McDougall. He's written a very interesting book called The Starch Solution. And he maintains that 70 to 80% of our diet should be based around starch. So that is potatoes, rice, whole grains. 70 or 80% of what we eat. He, as a young practicing doctor, was in Hawaii. And he realised a lot of Asians who had emigrated to Hawaii, the older Asians who tended to keep their traditional, quite healthy diet, didn't develop most of the chronic diseases, but their children were developing them because they were eating more of an American-based diet. And that's what made him kind of look into this. And he has a clinic in California, he has schools and so on. He works with a guy called Jeff Novick. Now again, if you've not heard of Jeff Novick, he's got some really interesting stuff on the internet. He's quite an amusing guy, but he has a fantastic video on YouTube about the calorific density of foods. I won't go into that now, but basically, we should really be eating foods that are not calorie dense, plant foods. No plant foods are calorie dense. They'll fill us up, they'll give us plenty of all the nutrients we need, and we're not eating lots of what people describe as empty calories, which is what causes weight to be put on us. Another interesting guy is this guy, he's called Neil Barnard. Now he runs, in America, an organisation called the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And they promote a whole food plant-based diet. So they're lobbying the government. They're up against the meat industry, the dairy industry, pharmaceutical companies. But he runs a clinic as well, no medication in his clinic. And he, quite famously, took in something like 180 people who were diabetic, and 140 of them, or thereabouts, were off medication within 3 weeks. That's not an exaggeration. Some people have been on medication for 20 years. Were being cured by changing. Why are more people not cottoning on to it? I mean, I've got friends who are doctors and they say, yeah, well, but, no, yeah, well, but, read the stuff. This is another heart surgeon called Joel Kahn. He's written this book called The Whole Heart Solution, exactly the same story, He actually set up a vegan restaurant cafe in the States, trying to promote this whole food plant-based diet commercial. And he's got lots of stuff on YouTube and the internet as well. This is a guy who calls himself plant-based pharmacist, and he wrote a book called Empty Medicine Cabinet. And he said you don't need medicines if you eat the right food. Exactly what Thomas Edison said over 100 years ago. He's called Dustin Rudolph, this guy. Now, of course, people started to say, well, can we get everything we need from plant foods? T. Colin Campbell, who famously wrote the China Study, I used to include some stuff in here about the China Study, I was getting too much information. If you don't know about the China Study, you ought to be reading that as well. But the China Study was this huge, as the name suggests, analysis of cancers across China. And he discovered it was all food related, it was all diet related, and he came to the conclusion, having been actually somebody who was a great supporter of animal proteins, who was brought up on a farm, he's going to realise that wasn't the way forward, and he was the guy who coined the phrase whole food plant-based diet. And as he says there is nothing that we can't really get from plants. There are a couple of exceptions. I think he himself takes 3 supplements. He takes a supplement for B12, which is the one that's always cropping up. He takes a supplement, I think, for omega-3, although if you eat plenty of flax seeds, I don't think you need supplements for omega-3. And he takes supplements for vitamin D. Now, we make vitamin D just by being out in the, it doesn't have to be bright sunshine, in the daylight. I don't think many people would say that vitamin D is a problem, but they might say B12 is a problem. I was wondering at one time whether that was a bit of a myth, but I did then, 2 of these events, meet people who'd been diagnosed with B12 deficiency. I tend to eat quite a lot of nutritional yeast, I don't really know what that is, that's fortified with B12. Marmite's fortified with B12. Meridian Foods, who do a lot of the nut butters, they do a yeast extract like Marmite. It's got packed with B12. It tastes a bit odd, it's not quite as nice as Marmite, but you know, I don't think that matters too much. And a lot of the non-dairy milks are fortified with B12. I tend not to buy those now, but I think, and I have started taking a B12 tablet only when I think about it, so once a week, once a fortnight or something I tend to do as well. Another guy I met this summer in Edinburgh is a very interesting character called Sid Garza Hillman. And he was talking at one of these vegan festivals. He'd come over from California, and he gave me a copy of his book. And his book is called Approaching the Natural, a Health Manifesto. Again, it's only a short book, it's about 150 pages long. He works in the only vegan resort in North America, which is in Mendocino on the Northern Californian coast. He's the nutritionist there. But his background was in philosophy, so the kind of bringing together his philosophical background and his nutritionist approach. He's basically saying humans live an incredibly unnatural existence. In terms of what we eat, and he proposes totally vegan diet, in terms of the amount of exercise we get. Now, these other guys all say we should be getting exercise. They don't say we should be going for a 10-mile run every day. They don't say we should be going for a 50-mile bike ride every day. More people ought to be taking the stairs instead of using the lifts. They ought to be walking places instead of going in their car. I mean, it's that level of exercise they're talking about, generally. If you do even more, I think the benefits are plain to be seen. The other thing that's interesting in what he talks about is, you know, we as living things are part of this planet, part of this solar system. And the way we humans live, we don't really touch the earth very often. You know, we're walking on concrete, we're walking on carpets, we're wearing shoes with soles. And actually, this is one of these things that I've heard a lot about in the past and not really thought about it much until I read his book. So he goes barefoot whenever he gets an opportunity, and he is absolutely convinced that in terms of our electric balance, you know, the balance of charges in our bodies, and antioxidants are one of the issues related to that, actually going barefoot and connecting with the earth is very beneficial. Again, that's a kind of another story in a way. The other analogy he's got, which is brilliant, he talks about we should regard our food like a gift box. And the gift box, the box itself and the wrapping, those are going to be our carbohydrates, our proteins and our lipids. Those are our macronutrients. So you eat that, whatever you eat. What's important is what is in the box. Phytonutrients, antioxidants, fibre, all those sorts of things. So he talks about heavy box foods, which are plant foods, and light box foods, which are mostly processed and animal foods. And he says we should always be eating heavy box foods, forget the light box foods. And I think he's probably right. Another interesting chap is this guy called Dan Buettner. Now, he wrote this book a year or two ago called The Blue Zones. He is, I think, a geographer, really, but he was in Sardinia, the Italian island. And he noticed while he was there that in a particular part of the island, very small part, not the whole island, there were a much larger number of people over 100 than you would normally expect there to be. And he kind of noted this and started to sort of observe them a bit. And he wondered two things. Why? And were there any other similar places around the world? And after quite a lot of research over a few years, he discovered there were 5 places like this in the world. There is Sardinia, there is the Japanese island of Okinawa, again it's a small part of the island. There's one of the Greek islands called Icaria, and there's a small area of Costa Rica, and there's the Seventh-day Adventists in California. They were mentioned in the previous talk. I was listening to that. Seventh-day Adventists in California. There's about 9,000 of them in that community. They're quite a well-known community in terms of being researched for their longevity and their very healthy lifestyle. And part of their religion is that they're mostly plant-based. Not 100%, but a lot of them are. And they live, 10 years on average longer than your average American or something like that. So what do all these 5 places have in common? Well, they weren't necessarily totally vegan, but they were generally pretty close to it. So plant-based food, plant-based nutrition was the norm in these 5 areas. Animal products were consumed, but only very occasionally, often on special occasions. Interestingly, they tended to be areas where they were low on stress. They all exercised. By exercise, I mean they kept themselves busy all the time. They didn't necessarily go running and so on, but they kept themselves busy. And actually, they also had quite good support structure within families and social groups. And that was true in all 5 of these areas. Interestingly, Okinawa, which is now adopting more of an American type diet, they're not living as long. Quite evident that the younger people are getting chronic conditions now that their parents and grandparents didn't. So it's quite an interesting book. He's got a website and Facebook page as well. So, how important is diet? A friend of mine said to me a while ago, I go walking the Lake District quite a lot, and he was commenting how fit I was at the time, and he said, sure, it's because of all the cycling you do. I think that's quite an interesting question. And what is the relative contribution of your diet and the amount of exercise you actually do? There doesn't seem to be an absolute consensus on this, but this seems to be, in general, 80% is down to your diet. And about 20% is the amount of exercise that you do. I don't think I could do the amount of cycling that I do if it wasn't really for my diet. Diet's extremely important. Just to highlight 1 or 2 people, world's top athletes here who do it on a vegan diet. This is a guy called Scott Jurek. Now, I don't tend to have heroes, but if I did, I think he would be one of my heroes. He wrote this book called Eat and Run. It was this book, which I read a few years ago, that finally, I've been vegetarian about 40 years. I haven't eaten meat for a very long time. I was still eating some dairy and some eggs, but I'd more or less cut those out. It was this book that made me cut it out altogether. He is an ultra-marathon runner, reckoned to be the best there has ever been. And by ultra-marathon, that means races that are longer than a normal marathon. His races will typically be 100 or 150 miles. He's broken all sorts of records over the years, and only last year he broke the record for the Appalachian Trail in America. I think he's in his early 40s now. He's more or less coming to the end of his running career in terms of competing. To break this record, believe it or not, he ran 50 miles a day on these sort of trails for 47 days consecutively. Incredible. All done on a vegan diet. Vegan cyclist who was talking in London last weekend is this lady, Christine Vidaros. She's a sort of world-class cyclocross competitor, and the thing she says about her vegan diet is she's noticed how quickly she recovers after a race. And I have to say, I agree with that. I mean, we cycled 130 miles that week. I didn't really need to recover. I mean, I just went home, had a shower, that was it, wasn't it? I had no aches and pains. I would have had aches and pains years ago, but I'm absolutely convinced that my diabetes doesn't happen anymore. It may start happening as I get older, I don't know. What a lot of people don't realise is that Carl Lewis, when he won all his Olympic medals, did so on a vegan diet. And he's promoting the whole food plant-based diet quite heavily in America as well. This is an interesting chap called Rich Roll. He was quite overweight at one stage in his life. You know, I think he had problems with alcohol. Decided to change his life around. I mean, you look at him now, he's one of the fittest guys in the world. He's done it all on a plant-based diet. He does an incredible podcast, which is quite well known amongst the sort of world of vegan athletes, where he interviews lots of different people, not just about athletics and exercise and veganism, but a lot of it is. An interesting guy. And this guy called Matt Fraser, he calls himself No Meat Athlete, and he's spurned the kind of industry, you know, he does t-shirts and all that sort of stuff. Another guy, Brendan Brazier, he's a Canadian triathlete. He's very big on what you should be consuming while you're training or while you're competing. That's his kind of big thing. One really interesting guy is this guy called Michael Arnstein. Now, as you can see there, he calls himself the Fruitarian. His website's called thefruitarian.com. He eats nothing but fruit. So obviously that's raw. He reckons to eat about 25 pounds of fruit every day. He's got 3 refrigerators. There's a little interview at the beginning on his website. And in this interview he said that morning for breakfast he'd eaten 15 oranges. I mean, that's the sort of thing he is convinced. He's run, I think, the 5th fastest 100 miles by a human being. Done it all on fruit. So I'm sort of coming towards the end now. I mean, yeah, I think it is difficult, very difficult, to persuade people in general that a whole food or plant-based diet is the way forward. I'm reading another book at the moment. There's a guy called Richard Oppenlander who features quite heavily in cowspiracy. He's the guy who talks about dead zones in the oceans and degradation of the rainforest and so on. And he was called to the European Parliament just about a year ago, just before they had the climate summit in Paris. And he's written a book, and it's called Comfortably Unaware. You know, headed buried in the sand sort of scenario. And I was reading on the train today coming down. I mean, you know, he says people just aren't aware, and they don't really want to know. I mean, that Melanie Joy's sort of pretext in her book is a bit, you know, and Will Tuttle, you know, people don't really want to know. And I'm afraid more and more people do need to know. So I mean, as far as my veganism is concerned, you know, I've been vegan now for several years. I just wished I'd done it a bit sooner, really. I'll just do a little plug at the end for the bike ride that we talked about at the beginning of the little video I showed you. So we did this ride last Saturday. We left the Vegan Society headquarters at 7 o'clock in the morning. We arrived eventually at Olympia at about 4:45, just in time to do our kind of question and answer session. And this organisation called Veganuary, you can see it here, they actually sponsored us in terms of buying us shirts and stuff like that, so we agreed to try and raise some money for them. If you don't know about Veganuary, they're not actually here this weekend, but as their name suggests, they have a website and they try and encourage people to pledge themselves to become vegan for the month of January. And they provide lots of support, lots of advice, lots of recipes and so on their website. And they're an extremely successful organisation. This year, 2016, 23,000 people signed up. Their recent feedback was that 65% of them remained vegan, so that's a lot of people. They are just in the middle of raising £24,000 to put 2,000 adverts on the London Underground in December. And they're expecting in the coming January, conservatively, 50,000 people. I think they're expecting more than that, but they're saying about 50,000 people. You know, they're having a big impact on encouraging and persuading people to become vegan. So if you want to help them with their work, you can either go onto my website and you'll find a link to our Just Giving page, or the Just Giving page. If you just go to Just Giving and look up Vegan Cycle Ride, it will take you to the page and you can donate. Right, I think that's it. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
Can you, I mean, I know everybody's different, but can you just give us an example of, you know, a day's diet?
Examples of, sorry?
A day's diet.
Daily diet. Actually, I never always get asked this, so I'll probably include some stuff in my presentation. Right, I almost always have porridge for breakfast, and what I tend to do is I soak the porridge oats in a non-dairy milk overnight in the fridge, so they're raw, I don't cook them. I tend to make my own oat milk, which is dead easy. You just soak some oats for an hour or two, you probably don't even need to be that long. Bang them in a blender. I leave all the fibre in. I wouldn't recommend using it if you're going to put in tea or coffee or anything. But I soak my oats in that. I also add a good tablespoon of flax, of milled flax, of chia seeds, of milled hemp, and I now add some cinnamon and some cloves after what Michael Greger said. So I just soak those in milk overnight and eat them with a load of fruit. And I have that most mornings. If I don't have that, I might skip breakfast occasionally, but that's generally what I would tend to eat. If I'm having to take food to work, I don't tend to eat a lot of bread anymore. I must admit, I always used to like bread. I have recently been eating some pita bread that I have a little quite near me, and their pita breads are quite good, and they're vegan. There's no milk in them or anything like that, and they're whole grain as well. I eat a lot of hummus. I do tend to buy hummus, which probably got a bit more oil in than I'm happy about. If I'm making my own hummus, I've recently come across a recipe where a tin of chickpeas, an avocado and lemon juice makes a great hummus. And I'll have that hummus with either olives or tomatoes or something like that. Evening meal, I'll always base it usually around potatoes or rice. Depends whether my wife or I are cooking, or if I'm cooking, I usually cook some onions. And when I first gave up oil, I thought, how on earth do you cook onions without oil? It works perfectly well with water. Put a bit of water in the bottom of the pan. You have to keep an eye on it a bit more because the water dries up and starts to burn. But you can cook onions like that. I'll then often add some chopped up peppers, and then I'll either add broccoli or kale or spinach. And I quite like to make things like, I eat quite a lot of nut butters actually. I eat peanut butter, I eat almond nut butter and cashew nut butter. Scott Jurek's got a really good recipe in his book. At the end of every chapter he has a different recipe, and one of them is using almond butter, mixing it with a non-dairy milk, and then adding various spices, and you can make it as spicy as you like, but it makes a really good kind of, it's supposed to be like a satay sauce really, so, you know, I do eat things like tofu, not a lot, but I do. I know there's a bit of controversy about tofu. I eat tempeh, but I find that I've made my own tempeh, which isn't very easy unless you've got something to keep it at a steady temperature all the time. I've actually found an Asian supermarket in Leeds, which isn't too far from where I live, that sells very good tempeh. It's quite cheap. So whenever I'm in Leeds, I get 10 or a dozen blocks of it and put them in the freezer. I've recently been eating some of Linda McCartney's quarter-pound burgers, which are vegan. You come across those? I think they're pretty good actually. For what they are. I don't eat them every day. I mean, but, you know. And also, I mean, Linda McCartney's sausages are vegan. Of course, Quorn isn't vegan. You realise that, don't you? Quorn's got eggs in it. There was a bit of a scandal, I don't know whether it was true or not. I did see somewhere their vegan range have got eggs in it or something. They had to recall it, haven't they? You see that? I don't know whether that's true or not, but there was some reference to that. I don't particularly bother with things that are pretending to be animal products. You know? I mean, I suppose the Linda McCartney's burgers are about the nearest I get to that. I make my own burgers sometimes. Very simple. If you get some beans, either black beans or red kidney beans, and you can grind them. You just grind them up with some flax. Flax kind of binds it together. A little bit of water to get the right consistency. Just make them into a burger shape. Stick them in the oven. They're great. You get your beans that way. That's good. Curries, lots of curries, chickpea curries, yeah. But always with whole grain rice, and I mix some wild rice in with that as well. Anything else? Oh, it's,
How much exercise do you recommend in a day?
well, for about 3 months over this year, I was cycling about 56 miles every day, which is too much, to be honest, if you're working. I think it's very personal how much exercise. It's how much you can manage, really, I think. Do you go running or anything like? Do you go cycling? Even if you just have a look at some of these guys. I mean, you just go for a brisk walk for half an hour. That's what they talk about. You know, I mean, you think about it. There are an awful lot of people who effectively get no exercise at all. I mean, none. They get up, they walk out to the car, they drive to work, they walk to the desk or wherever, they go back to the car, they come back home, they sit in front of the television. I know that sounds very cynical, but an awful lot of people live like that. So walk a bit more, walk up and down the stairs instead of taking the lifts, run up and down the stairs. That's it.
Are you still working full time?
I'm going back to, I'm going to do 3 days a week next week. I'd rather not be working, to be honest. I've got so many other things to do, but I'm a teacher actually. I keep getting asked to go and do covers and things like that. I've been working full time, yeah, until now.
Right.
But I always make sure I cycle to and from wherever I'm working. At the moment it's only 5 miles each way, which actually is okay. If you go quite hard for 5 miles, I prefer it was a little bit longer, but mine's alright this week.
Of all the books
Yes.
that you put up there, we've read the Michael Greger How Not to Die.
Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. Which of those books, if you're trying to get somebody to read one of them, just to try and get some facts in there, which one would you recommend?
Well, the John Robbins book's pretty good. The one called The Food Revolution. I mean, the interesting thing about him is, you know, he was brought up, as I say, eating lots of animal products, and he realised, in fact, even his father admitted towards the end of his life that his son had been right. The Melanie Joy book's slightly academic in a way. It's not particularly academic, but she's right to give more point of view from an academic. Sid Garza-Hillman's book's brilliant. The one called Approaching the Natural. But I think I'd recommend people read The Food Revolution.
Watching that, some conspiracy videos.
Cowspiracy and Forks Over Knives. People haven't seen those.
That changed me.
Well, you can't help but be influenced by those, I don't think. You're a strange person if you're not. I mean, if you haven't seen Forks Over Knives, Caldwell Esselstyn is given, I don't know, about 12 or 15 people who are chronically ill with all sorts of conditions. One guy in Florida is overweight, he's on about 6 or 8 medications every day, he's got diabetes, he's got high, you know, he's got everything wrong with him. And Caldwell Esselstyn gets him off all his medications by changing his diet. I mean, all of them. And this guy, you know, I said, you know, I can't believe it. People, doctors and so on, were kind of giving up on them. And these guys are saying, you know, it's not rocket science, change your diet, you'll be fine. I mean, I'm sure that people who've gone so far down the line with chronic disease, it's quite difficult to reverse it. But, and T. Colin Campbell says, as do some of these other guys, if everyone adopted the right diet, we could cut the American health budget by 80%. And we're talking about trillions of dollars. The cost of treating diabetes in America at the moment is going up by $9 billion every year, going up. And you know, young children are now being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Probably here as well, to be honest. I'm a bit frustrated. I go and search the internet. It's hard to find figures for the UK. I did find something recently that said actually, #1 cause of early death in the UK is cancer, and coronary heart disease is second, apparently. It's the other way around in America. Okay, thank you.